The current state of general balance in Path of Exile 2 Early Access is surely not what grinding your games expected, right, Exiles? Right? It has resulted in the most extreme of scenarios, a player's speed and the progression to that speed that is out of this world, and unimaginable to many. However, even with those ridiculous results currently possible in Path of Exile 2, some struggle to even progress their characters. Yet those struggles are not what I'd like to focus on entirely today. It's the speed of combat and how quickly it ramps up for many players due to player power. But before we truly get into the devilish details, let me just calm any heated exiles out there. I think Path of Exile 2 has room for basically all types of speed in the game. Super slow, gritty gameplay to hyperdrive all hell breaks loose heroes. But here's the kicker. Power should feel earned, either through ingenuity, not the item, merciless dedication, or insane bits of luck. It shouldn't just click on and happen in most scenarios. However, there's a gigantic elephant in the room we'll discuss before the end of the video that can, unfortunately, never be solved by any genius fit of game design by Grinding Your Games or any other game development studio in the future. We're past the event horizon, especially in ARPG land. Anyway, do you remember the pitch of combo-based combat? How about meaningful monster design and battles even in the endgame? While this idea is very real in Act 1 and mostly realized in Acts 2 and 3, a very impactful switch flips once you hit Cruel difficulty, and again once you hit the endgame and the Atlas. There's obviously a problem I'd posit, and it's exactly what this video shall examine and break down strand by strand. We're in astonishing territory for Path of Exile 2 right now, given what the planned progression of player speed was pitched as. It's incredibly different than the current range experienced by numerous folks playing the game. We all know ARPGs likely will evolve into crazy levels of speed for most players deep into their lifetime, well, except for Diablo 4 and now PoE 2. I know I mentioned one elephant in the room just a moment ago that we have yet to talk about. Let's talk about another elephant currently in the room too. Spyfire242 says, it varies because balance is so completely off. The difference between the strongest and weakest builds, skills, classes is insane. It was pretty bad in PoE 1 as well, but this is new levels of bad balance, and I hope Grinding Your Games reconsiders mid-league balance changes, at least in early access. I seriously tend to agree with them, but given we've still not experienced a major patch or heard from the devs explicitly on what their true intention truly was with the player speed and progression in Path of Exile 2, we're left sifting through all the feedback, past interviews, and a few murky current statements. I mean, the level of speed and how fast zooming started was totally too quick, right? Unless this was planned all along by Grinding Your Games and I am way off base. This is definitely a possibility, but it's one I refuse to currently put faith in. I think they also want the extreme power to feel earned by players of all types and archetype choices. There are breakpoints primarily in Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Cruel, Endgame, and Pinnacles and beyond, which should of course be there. However, the source of the present-day player progression and speed of game problem, mostly during the endgame, cannot be distilled down to just a single catalyst, even if many point to the imbalance of the game. And even then, there's great debate in the community as to how fast characters should be and how quickly we should be able to progress to levels of godlike strength. Again, that is exactly what this super long video is all about. Additionally, as I mentioned a minute ago, the intention from the devs is a bit unclear too, given the design of the game and how long it has been left relatively untouched, alongside a few words Jonathan said during a podcast with DM and Ghazi.
The game does take a bit of a turn suddenly when you get to endgame of like, it doesn't really feel like it really does feel very different from campaign to endgame. And yeah, as I said, it's just a matter of sort of easing that transition, making that a little bit better and smoothing out that more for sure.
I want to hone into 2 points here. Because you talk about it feels like a different game, sort of a different sense of progression at least. Is that intended, and do you like that as a design principle? Because I've seen people say that they really like the campaign, then they get to maps and they feel like it starts blasting, it's almost a different game at that point. So I think the audience would love to know how you feel about that difference.
Look, you do need to get to the point at some point where you feel incredibly powerful. However, I would say that there is like a bit of a switch flip right now that's kind of not quite right. Like there's definitely something that ain't right going on there.
Well, there's two. There is the character power side. Like a lot of people are getting to endgame and they aren't just becoming gods all of a sudden, right? A lot of people are struggling and falling off and can't sustain maps and are dying and you know, it's not like you get to endgame and all of a sudden you're ultra powerful.
Okay, back to the catalyst that cannot exactly be tracked. This is Path of Exile 2, a game with numerous possibilities and limitless types of players. Let me lay it out. We have high-skilled players with tons of knowledge who progress their characters unbelievably fast and hyper-optimize every single mouse click in the game. Normal skilled players who are playing with maces and likely going slowly, and then that very same type of player going with quarterstaffs who become blasters due to the nature of the weapon's current design. Then there's zero-knowledge players busting out minions on an Infernalist who insta-give the Arbiter of Ash in their very first encounter and end up knowing none of the mechanics. There's also knowledgeable mercenaries who struggle to even get to phase 2 of Iron Citadel Geonor in the Atlas due to their damage being out of whack in a bad way. Finally, there are players who are casually making their way through the game and might still be in Act 2 over 2 months after beginning the game, or another casual dude who found a bow at the Act 1 vendor, which will carry him all the way into cruel difficulty. Succinctly, there are unlimited factors at play here when it comes to speed of progression through a character's journey. Knowledge, skill, class, weapon, passive tree, item use, pure luck, willpower, and so on and so forth. Then there's the whole concept of how people obtain items and how that fiddles with progress. Self-found gear, traded gear, and just insane luck with gear potentially trivializing everything you encounter for the next chunk of progression. And did I mention the balance of skills already? Yeah, I think I did. And then there's that secret elephant we're going to talk about eventually. So how in the world can you balance this out? How can grinding gear games fix their game, as some people screech? Let me say this here and now. I do not envy them, but I do respect them and think they are going to find a good balance here eventually. But still people shall ask, is it an impossible task? Will ARPGs always deteriorate into one-button clicking fests in the endgame for nearly all builds at a quick pace for some and a snail's pace for others? Well, some Path of Exile 2 players, as showcased by these polls, are okay with the current speed meta of the game. Many are not. Some want it to be a Souls-like entirely. Then there are others who do not want the game to become Diablo 4, wherein you can hit max level casually in about 5 hours. I can tell you, that's never going to happen. Then some would like to be able to skip the campaign and progress to the end game basically at the start of the game. Another guarantee? Not happening. Others would like to see the game stay around the speed of play in PoE 1. Some are seriously looking for a swap up compared to PoE 1 so they can enjoy PoE 2 in a different manner. My point is, there are a bunch of different opinions here. I, however, am only slightly displeased with the speed of power progression and would like to see it changed in a few major and minor ways, and thoroughly understand it shall. The Path of Exile 2 of today will be thoroughly unrecognizable in 1 year. So let me just take a moment to go off about what I see as the current big problems with both player power and player progression in Path of Exile 2. I do not think you should ever be able to delete a boss in Path of Exile 2. These fights don't need to be 10 minutes or 20 minutes, but player power should be reeled in so that the maximum strength of a character actually causes you to need to fight the boss. So that was a good example of a major problem that I see with balance currently. Now, what would be a minor problem that I have with the game when it comes to progression? Well, it would be something as simple as showcasing to players that they should be going to vendors in the acts, in Cruel, and even in the endgame, and for people in Trade League to use trade, to try out trade, to realize it exists, because a lot of people, I'm not even kidding, don't realize that trade is a thing in Path of Exile 2 unless explicitly showcased. And right now, there's nothing pushing you to the currency exchange with Alva. There's nothing pushing you to go to the trade site in Path of Exile 2. If you didn't look online on the forums or Reddit or YouTube, you would never know that Path of Exile 2 has a trade site wherein you can get an upgrade if you have gone through dozens and dozens of quarterstaves or body armors and have not received a single upgrade. That helps with player progression. That is something that they should change to iron out progression for newer players. Okay, I'm glad I got a couple examples in, because I say that I'm mostly fine with the progression, but I have some major qualms and some minor qualms. Those are 2 examples of the qualms themselves. Back to discussing all that's going on with the player speed and progression in Path of Exile 2. I think a lot of players feel exactly like Infinite Next 8165 here. Acts are great. Cruel is too fast, and Endgame is just PoE 1 on a bit less steroids. Act 1 is what was promised, and I hope that pace and feeling can be spread through Acts 4, 5, 6, and Endgame. Still, I'd like to calmly and entertainingly, hopefully, lay out several ideas and points of view in this video, some of which I may entirely disagree with. First, the original vision for Path of Exile 2 combat and progression. Next, what Path of Exile 2 character speed progression is today as of patch 0.1.1 and the reasons for its present state. And finally, what I'd like to see the power progression of characters entail in the future alongside the maximum power cap. This honestly might be surprising to many of you. And at the end of it all, answer that burning question in the back of all of our minds. Who should grinding your games be balancing Path of Exile 2 for? It relates to the elephant, the secret elephant in the room. Please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the sub notification bell for plenty more Path of Exile 2 content in the future. We're on the path to 100,000 subscribers. I could sure use your help if you enjoy the channel. Now, let's delve in. A long time ago in a land far, far away, in an era with Path of Exile 1 expansions every 3 to 4 months, Grinding Gear Games laid out a unique vision for Path of Exile 2 and the future of action RPGs. This beautiful vision stood on 4 pillars. 1. Slower tactical combat. 2. Engaging enemy encounters. 3. Limited instantaneous healing. And 4. Fluid animations. Slower tactical combat was envisioned as players using multiple skills on their characters, sometimes comboing them together, other times just utilizing different skills for certain situations. This would be made possible as every skill could use the maximum number of support gems, 5. Engaging enemy encounters was seen as a necessity for strategical combat. Enemies needed to have interesting abilities to counteract players and force them to think outside the box. This would be accomplished with massive monster variety, compelling locations for combat, and randomly generated modifiers on monsters and powerful abilities even on normal monsters. Boss encounters, of course, were built on this idea too. Every boss encounter was to be an event, a spectacle wherein the boss had multiple abilities and forced the player to be intelligent with their movements and ability use. Honestly, this is where many of the Dark Souls and Elden Ring comparisons come into play, as the boss fights are quite obviously inspired by Souls and Souls-like game titles. Except the Arbiter of Ash, that's some Final Fantasy XIV level stuff. Limited instantaneous healing was intended to ensure combat felt like a war of attrition, and to ensure you were slower and tactical. Health flasks and their refilling was to be scarce. Recovering both mana and life was supposed to be an important part of the game, one that was constantly interacted with to give you at least 2 resources to constantly grapple with. As a result too, this meant that combat should not always boil down to one-shotting or getting one-shot, except with certain boss abilities. If a character was to die, there would be a chance to react in most scenarios, but it wasn't a slow dribble of life. Fluid animations were what brought all these things together, for both player characters and monsters alike. For these 3 prior ideas to be good, they need to feel good to play, and the animations of each and every skill, enemy and ally, were vital to that concept. Bringing these 4 ideas together solidified what Grinding Gear Games saw as the next generation ARPG they were building with Path of Exile 2. Of course, there were other layers and ideas, but I'd reckon these 4 things determine how fast combat plays, how quick your character is, and what progression feels like in Path of Exile 2. Over and over during the lead up to Path of Exile 2's initial release, players of all kinds kept asking the developers if the game would be slow or more detailed, slower than Path of Exile 1. Their answer was always, well, clear, but not so clear. They didn't want the game to be slow or explicitly slower than PoE 1, they wanted it to be more engaging. If that meant the game would be seen or played as slower at the end of the day, then that was fine with them. They always wanted to allow automation and the ability to be carefree and play with a single button, but it would be at the cost of power, and those low maintenance builds would not necessarily always be the strongest. All of that was theoretical. What is the reality? When Path of Exile 2 finally launched on December 6, 2024, and people leapt into the campaign, the Grinding Gear Games outlined vision seemed quite accurate. The campaign is essentially what had been outlined and explained many times over by Grinding Gear Games in interviews and showcases. Many battles were strategic and intense, character upgrades were steady, some fights were attritional, and everything just felt right, especially on your first character. Then the cracks began to form as players entered the second run-through of the campaign, Cruel Mode, wherein the balance just felt off. Monster health and damage was scaled up, yes, but these areas were designed for Act 1, 2, and 3 power characters, monsters and all, not characters decked out in 2 batches of ascendancy points and decent gear. This is an area that's difficult to truly critique, as we know it is very temporary and will be replaced with Acts 4, 5, and 6 in good time. I'm giving Grinding Gear Games a bit more leeway here. Again, the fissures widened as characters exploded into the endgame, especially on certain builds. Zooming was alive and well. Now, we know the endgame was pulled together in around 7 months just before the launch of Early Access, but the build possibilities were tremendous, and the majority of them were exactly what grinding your games were trying to discourage in Path of Exile 2. Extremely powerful automated setups, single button builds that annihilated screens, and characters that instantly deleted bosses without seeing any of their mechanics. This, in my opinion, is a big problem, especially the longer it lasts in PoE 2, if it's not intentional. So, in actuality, what we ended up getting was a decently balanced progression in Acts 1 through 3, a large hike in power in Cruel mode, and another set of leaps in power in the endgame. To some, these power jumps didn't occur at all if they were playing, for example, maces. To others, they occurred far less and weren't nearly as drastic. And to a group of others, they happened almost instantly and caused the bulk of the game to become trivial way too quickly. We'll touch on those final two groups near our Event Horizon discussion soon. Regardless, what grinding your games was trying to avoid with player speed was already happening a few days into PoE 2's early access period. Wacky balance with certain character interactions, odd balance in the endgame, intense speed of monsters, clashing ideologies with rare monster hunting and thick density breaches, and oh so much more caused players to form a bit of a debate. Was this level of speed actually intentional? Was PoE 2 supposed to play this closely to PoE 1 in the endgame, or was this just a miss in terms of balance from grinding your game's perspective as they rushed to prepare an endgame Luke for avid ARPG players? As many have, and will point out again, a big source of this progression speed debate is just balance. But what we've really yet to see is how grinding your games will tackle this in the near and long-term future of Path of Exile 2. So let's take a gander at what the future of Path of Exile 2's player progression and speed might look like. First from grinding your game's perspective, then that of the masses, then from my own point of view. I like to split these versions into the reality, the vision of the many, and then my own personal desire for Path of Exile 2, which might be a bit surprising. Grinding your games cannot be pleased with the current state of Path of Exile 2, the speed of it, particularly in the endgame. I think they're quite pleased with the progression of Act 1, 2, and 3, totally understanding Cruel mode as a placeholder, and know there's something wrong with the endgame progression. Right? They even pointed it out in their most recent State of Path of Exile 2 forum post, wherein they say endgame progression balance is off, with a bit more elaboration on what they've done with the endgame already. Mainly this snippet right here. The endgame is one of the hardest areas to test in an online game. It takes quite a lot of play to get to the point where you can form an opinion on what is good and what is bad. So having such a large number of players get to the endgame has been incredibly valuable. Now, what exactly they mean by that post can be interpreted in many ways. Is it too fast, too slow, too hard, too easy, too bad, too good? A combination of everything depending on whether you're talking about boss difficulty, tower use, map progression, navigating the Atlas, or something? We'll just have to wait and see, I suppose. But they know something is off here and they're on the case. I suspect drastic shakeups in 0-2-0, and I'd err on the side of them slowing down the game, mainly by making monsters slower, ensuring players cannot almost instantly start blowing up screens with stuff like Herald of Ice and the unique ring combo, and making sure you find bosses at the proper time, not when you can instantly delete them and trivialize what should be an epic encounter. However, and I cannot overstate this enough, I think their decision to not address balance more frequently will hurt the player base in the long term during early access. It is going to extend the early access period, and if it is far off from where they want it to be, the longer the game exists in the current state, the worse off player expectations and reactions will be if or when they finally change it up. Succinctly, I think they'll turn the endgame from a kill or be killed loop into something more similar to the original vision and what we see in the campaign, but increasingly faster paced as you move toward your character's maximum power. But I hope they don't swing too hard and make it an absolutely ridiculous grind to become powerful, wherein you need to rely on certain elephants to progress at a reasonable pace. Now, what do the masses desire? Surprisingly, that's quite a tough cookie to crack. There are so many different types of player, so we're going to need to narrow this down somehow. For this video, I'm going to use the polls and comments I've been sharing throughout. Well, on YouTube, the plurality of people who voted in the poll feel like it's just right the way it is. How interesting. I actually think they're pretty close to the truth here. Wait a second, wait a second. And it mirrors my high level opinion. I think depending on how you play Path of Exile 2, the speed of progression is in a decent spot with a couple big changes needed and some minor alterations on top of those larger shifts. For example, I'm playing Path of Exile 2 on builds I make myself, mostly with self-found gear. I'm only trading when I absolutely need an upgrade to progress in Waystone tiers or boss difficulty. I think a lot of people responding with "it's just right" are probably players in Trade League playing in a quite similar manner. Remember the event horizon I mentioned at the start of the video? The other elephant in the room? Well, here it is. We are in a day and age where everything is solved quickly. Videos are made of the best builds and the best tips, and they spread like wildfire. In an era wherein many people look up how to play a game or let others entirely play the game for them, how in the world can you balance for everyone? You cannot. In a world like this, you need to balance, or should balance, for the player who plays the game for themselves with minimal help from the outside world. And if you view Path of Exile 2 from that lens, it's actually in a decent spot with speed bumps in Cruel and throughout the endgame, and of course there are balance issues, but overall, it's in a good spot. However, if a player uses the most efficient build, campaign, and endgame guide they can find, it's quite possible their progression speed graph will look like this. In my opinion, that is a bad graph, or at least not the way I'd like to enjoy a game. I would like for grinding your games to focus on making the base Path of Exile 2 experience feel as good as possible for those who don't fully rely on guides to propel them into godhood. If a developer balances against those playing with maximum efficiency, it will completely exile a huge chunk of the player base. Sure, in the endgame there should be some crazy aspirational content that even challenges those following the most optimized guides, but the majority of the game shouldn't be balanced around that, because it's impossible to balance. And I am strictly talking about Path of Exile 2 here. And no, I don't want us to go too far in that direction and turn Path of Exile 2 in a game like Diablo 4. No shots, no shots. So, however, if grinding your games attempt to balance for the average Path of Exile 2 player, a person who enjoys being challenged, likes learning constantly, and isn't afraid to grind a little bit and finds failure fun, the game eventually will be in the perfect spot, at least for me. I'll also give a little shout out to Solo Self-Found here. It's a very interesting challenge mode for Path of Exile 2 wherein you cannot trade or party up with other players. While it is definitely a great experience, I don't think the game should be fully balanced around this mode either. I think the player progression of speed and power should be sculpted around a player defined by the following qualities: trades when needed, enjoys a challenge, doesn't usually use guides, makes the majority of their own builds, knows a bit of grind is needed, loves learning all the time, and has fun with failure and retrying. I may have just described myself, but I think there's a sizable group of players out there just like me. As a final note, the developers of Path of Exile 2 need to clasp onto a vision and see it through. Yes, they should attempt to appeal to a wide swath of players, but as many excellent game devs have said over the years, if you try to make a good game for everyone, it'll be perfect for no one. I really hope Grinding Your Games continues to craft a game perfect for some people, a game some will love. As a result, of course, it just might turn into a game a decent chunk of people will hate. But that's okay, because there are experiences out there for all of us. Might not be a game that you like, and it might not be a game that I end up liking. I hope I'm wrong on that. I really am. As always, thanks for watching. Like the video, subscribe for much more content, check out my Patreon, and watch this video about the Trials of Ascension debate right now, or one of the many Still Sane podcast episodes with personalities like Jungroan, Rax and Trax, and Dreamcore. I'll see you in the next video, my fellow exiles. Stay sane.